imperative. And of course, when you have a moral imperative, you don't have a choice about the action. Some action must be taken. Our agency, our human agency, must be brought forward to bear on the problem. Which is, of course, why we are so completely engaged as a nation in reducing our carbon footprint. After all, we are one of the most religious nations in the world. Well, I'm a little sarcastic there in bearing witness to a distinctive gap between the information we have, which continues to pile up. Even the naysayers or the climate deniers or whatever, I think we need to move off those terms. It's well past time to move off those terms. Even they have kind of had to back up and start allowing for the reality of climate change. But what is our response, and why is it so meandering and minimal? And why is it that you can see such a great difference between someone who's completely committed to the work of lightening their footprint upon the earth versus those who are not committed to so doing? Well, part of the reason is that we are in a sort of perils of Pauline moment. For those of you who are old enough to know your parents or grandparents saw these things, for those of you who are not, these are serials that appeared on Saturdays between the movies, in which Pauline would always be in a terrible fix right at the end of the mini-movie, which would induce behaviors that would bring people back the next week to put their nickel or dime down and to see what happened to Pauline. Well, here we are. Glenn is suggesting we are tied to the raft that is heading for the falls. And in a certain way we are. We have enough information to say we are headed for the falls. But contrary to any good, sensible behavior, we seem to be rowing toward them with all due haste. And so in this moment we have to ask ourselves, what is it that must change in order for us to actually act morally in response to the information we have? So we're Unitarian Universalists here, and that means we're slightly off of the mainstream in terms of what a church might be or a religious community might be. We sometimes struggle with this. People say, I don't believe in organized religion, and we say, great, you're made for Unitarian Universalism. We're not organized in any way, shape, or form. But the truth of the matter is that one of the teachings of my faith is the continual nature of revelation, which commits us all to continue learning, that we are never done learning, that the information is never complete, that what we know and must rely upon for moral decision-making is a continually revisional body of knowledge. And so my religion teaches me that I can't sit back and be done, but that my job, part of my role, is to work with people to solve problems. And reason is a part of what we embrace as an ingredient in growing towards wisdom. We must practice the art of employing reason when we analyze things. Well, what is in our way is clearly human behavior. And there are some things we know about human behavior that say that if we are waiting for the powers on high to pass the right laws, to set up the right carbon tax or cap and trade or whatever your preferred version is, if we continue waiting, that's part of the immorality and the failure to respond to the imperative. What do we know about that? Well, there's been all manner of changes that have changed behavior over time. And the analysis of these changes in behavior have become more scientific and more well studied and better understood. Whether it's foot binding in China, or dueling in Europe, or smoking in the United States, we actually know some things about what makes for moral agency and behavior. And this is what we know. That it takes a small group of dedicated people who embrace a new private sentiment about what needs to change. And that rather than focus exclusively on the understanding of law requirements and other obligations that will force people to change or to dissent, and we know there are many dissenters, that what we need to do instead is to externalize the private sentiment and make it unacceptable for people to continue doing what they have done in the past. To the point where no one wants to foot mine, no one wants to smoke, no one wants to be a hog at the trough of the carbon enterprise. I suspect that most of you are here because you are living a different way than your neighbors. The question we have to engage, the moral imperative, isn't to force our neighbors or to compel them, because we've already shown how terribly inefficient we are at doing that. Everybody likes their shiny new car with the responsive gas pedal. How do we instead, not just for ourselves, but for the moral owners of the society and for the economic owners of society, make it so unpleasant to be an energy hog and to have a large footprint that no one will fail to avoid that behavior, certainly most in public. To do this is the religious proposition that we're engaged with, to change hearts and minds, and not to wait to be saved by legislation which clearly is so bottled up in our country that waiting for it to change seems to be the very definition of insanity, much less immorality. What is it we can do here in Virginia, in Richmond, in our counties? What is it we can do to change the sentiment? Because that is the moral opportunity that sits before us, to which we can respond. It then addresses, or it begins to address, an involvement that invites all generations and all people into that understanding. We have to become moral teachers, perhaps as much as we are activists and legislative advocates.
When I set this up, I knew that we would get some challenges and some challenging thinking going here, and I appreciate that very much. That's a really interesting perspective there. Let me introduce Reverend Ben Rober. I've had the good fortune to call him Rabbi who has come out to many events that relate to justice, and particularly energy justice, coal, because he actually knows a lot about the coal fields particularly. And with that, I'll just introduce Rabbi Rober, who is of West Virginia.
After serving 22 years as a military chaplain, I've been called Padre, Father, Reverend. It really doesn't matter. And in England, they were called the Right Reverend Rabbis, so it all works. The British are also very formal. My dad was born and grew up in Huntington, West Virginia. I was born in Huntington, West by God, Virginia as well. And it's a state that is the epitome of what coal does, good and bad, and what coal owners can do, good and badly. And so just the destruction of the environment, the beauty of the state alone should give us pause. But one of the things that I've noticed is, for any of our discussions, is facts and figures really do not matter. And that's really important for us to understand. We're dealing with the moral imperatives. That it's the frame, it's the religious, spiritual, ethical, moral frame. And other sides don't get a pass. It's not your God against my God, prayers at 50 meters. It's that you don't get to say that, okay? You can say what you want, but you can't back it up. When I look at the creation story, it's rather clear. We're the source of creation's co-partners here. There is a Hasidic rabbi who said that God is helpless. It's a nice book. It's got all kinds of good rules, some questionable rules. It's got stuff we can interpret, but it just sits on a shelf collecting dust unless we become the true co-partners. We become God on earth. That is, we become God-like, made in the image of God, the likeness, in the behaviors in which we engage. When I hear from those who are end-of-dayers, I don't have to worry about it. What the heck? The world's going to end shortly, for a given value of shortly. I have to ask the question, are you saying that just to excuse yourself, or do you actually mean it? I don't give a pass for I believe it, because few do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be working so hard for the profits and the money I want to keep. And you hold their feet to the fire. There is not an agreement in the Western world on religious approaches and spiritual approaches. There are lots of ways of looking at our unique ways of interpreting Scripture. I rather like the Native American approach that says we are responsible to think about what we do in the world in which we live 7 generations forward. Good number Jewishly, by the way. 7 really works well. So I can do that. That preaches for me. And when we think of that, then we have to check our egos and our selfishness at the door. If we are part of a community, then what I want has to give way to what we need. And the American mythos of the cowboy mentality that I get to do what I want, and I get it, and I get to keep it, and if I got it, it's mine, and you don't get it. Because the world has scarcity, there's only so much. All of which is false. Yeah, I like what I have. I'd like to get more. But at what cost? We live in a world of abundance if we make the choice to share it with each other and not to keep it. I appreciate the nature of a company called Dominion Power. And I realize it's the old Dominion state. I get where the name comes from. And then we get into the stickiness of you have dominion over the earth. That doesn't mean you get to trash it or take what you want or muck it up with high carbon content. It means, if we are again the co-partners of the one who created this, responsible. There is a rabbinic story from 1,500 years ago. And God's talking to Adam and Eve. He says, look at all this. Looks pretty good, right? You got one chance. You screw it up, and it gets destroyed. And I'm not making another one. Thank you very much. I did it right the first time. You keep it right. And so that places a moral obligation upon each and every one of us. And not just us in a Western religious or cultural environment, but to realize that we are part of a greater whole. Not in the sense of a flat earth. As Thomas Friedman, don't forget the Friedman unit, it's very important. That's the war will end in 6 months, but that's okay. In Iraq. Various values in 6 months. But we have this interconnectedness with all. I was in Japan last summer. Our daughter was teaching English there. And I watched an amazing spiritual moment. We joined thousands of Japanese, mostly Japanese civilians, from the very little to grandmas and grandpas, climbing Mount Fuji. Because summertime is the one time you can get all the way to the top pretty easily. We couldn't get beyond 7,000 feet because too many grannies were climbing a mountain. I didn't have enough time to get all the way up and all the way down. And it's a spiritual moment. And you look at it and it's pristine. And they clean up after each other. And they have a great train system. Yeah, things are messed up because they had nuclear energy, and that isn't necessarily the best way to go. but the approach that they have had, understanding the importance that what they do affects the person next to them, is critical. One of the important Jewish spiritual directions is called Musar. And it talks about how one becomes whole. And the only way in which I become whole, my ego becomes mature and full, is not by worrying about what I get, but when I bear the burden of the other. Only when I understand I am connected to the flow of other human beings and have an obligation to assure the world in which they live, and their children, and their children's children live, and those who are others elsewhere who I may never have met, can I become whole? Can my soul become whole? And as such, then, I have the obligation to assure that their needs are met as well. And so when we come into community, we have to realize that some of what we want as individuals must stop at the door. And I surrender some of that individual niceness, what I wish, and realize I have to work with others, for others, and together with others. If we are to be co-partners in bringing shalom, wellness, wholeness, fullness, health to the world in which we live, then we realize that only through our partnership, our acting in God-like ways, are we able to heal this world. We have, therefore, the obligation to speak it, to live it, to model it, and to challenge those who would say otherwise, politely, but firmly, saying, you don't get a pass. I'm tired of other people misusing my scripture for their selfish purposes. I have run out of cheeks to turn. 1, 2, 3, 4. Completely used up, and it is time that I and we make the stand that morally and ethically, the high ground is God's co-partners and the wellness of the world in which we live.
Katie Preston is the director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, and some of you may be familiar with that organization, others are not, but one thing is very clear. The environmental community in and of itself cannot just address climate, cannot succeed in addressing climate change. One, because it's not just an environmental issue, and two, because we all have to come together to address this issue. One of the important partners in dealing with climate change, as you've already really heard, is the faith community. So with that, I'd like to introduce Katie Preston.
I just want to also join with Glenn as a kind of co-presenter for the evening to thank all of you for joining us on this fine evening, and thank our other panelists for joining us this evening. This really is an important conversation for us to be having, and I will give a quick disclaimer. Interfaith Power and Light is a national organization. We're represented in 40 different states, working with over 14,000 communities of faith on this issue of a religious response to global warming, to climate change, to climate disruption, whatever label you want to put on it, to the world that we are experiencing today. And recognizing that all major traditions of faith have this ethic of a moral call to care for creation. I myself am going to be ordained in the Presbyterian tradition, but in my work with Interfaith Power and Light, I work with partners in all kinds of faith communities. And it's always humbling for me to work with folks from other faith traditions and to hear their perspectives and the work that we're doing, because I truly feel that our role and responsibility as Interfaith Power and Light across the country is to reframe this conversation as a moral responsibility, as something you don't get to choose sides on. We are all one global community, no matter what our political background is, no matter what our religious background is. We are all sharing this little world called Earth, we have a responsibility to our neighbors to create a healthy and sustainable future. A few months back in the work that we are doing, Glenn and I and our partners with Virginia Conservation Network and Environment Virginia, I wrote sort of a response to President Obama's second inaugural address in his State of the Union. And I'm just going to share some of those comments with you and then also reflect a little bit on what my colleagues have said tonight. So in his inaugural address, President Obama reminded us that the earth has been, quote, commanded to our care by God. And as such, we must remember that it is our moral responsibility, both for our neighbors and for our future, to stop debating the science of the issue and to start moving forward on caring for all that has been entrusted to us. So many times we neglect to address this issue from the faith community, but just like the civil rights movement came out of the religious community in the 60s, so too should the movement for environmental justice. As people of faith especially, we are called to act, to respond faithfully to our call to keep the creation good. Each of the major faith traditions has an ethic of creation care in their theology, and we believe that the world around us was given to us as a gift to care for and to tend on behalf of the Creator. We also believe that we have an obligation to the marginalized people around the world who are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. The United States represents only 5% of the world's population, yet contributes over 25% of the world's pollution. It is vital that our leadership, especially the President, begin to address the reality and magnitude of climate change with legislation that moves us to reducing our carbon emissions and transitioning our energy economy to clean, renewable energy. In his State of the Union address, the President outlined the need to, quote, act before it's too late, and said, if Congress won't act soon to protect future generations, I will. I, the President, will direct my cabinet to come up with executive actions we can take now and in the future to reduce pollution. It is fantastic to hear that the President understands the need to respond and to respond immediately. President Obama has the opportunity in the next 4 years to leave a climate legacy that respects the science and the need to create a sustainable future for our children and grandchildren. We must hold him accountable on the promises and statements he made this year in both his inaugural address and the State of the Union to care for creation. We must show the President that he has our support to leave a climate legacy that strengthens the EPA, updates the regulations and rules associated with the Clean Air Act, reduces our carbon emissions in vehicles, and decreases our reliance on all fossil fuels, not just foreign imports of dirty energy. As people of faith who believe in the moral imperative to care for all of creation, we encourage President Obama to leave a climate legacy in his second term. And through the work that our coalition is doing, we have some things that we are encouraging the President and Congress to take action on, and afterwards we'd love to talk with you more about how to do that. But I want to reflect some on comments that my colleagues have made. In his opening, Glenn talked about the idea of losing hope because of all of the chaos that climate change has created. Just last year in Virginia, we experienced the derecho coming through. I unfortunately, or thankfully, either way, was not here yet when that came through. But my dad was on the coast of North Carolina in his boat and had some significant damage because of the severe winds of that storm. And I know that there were a lot of other impacts here in Virginia with that. We saw Superstorm Sandy hit the furthest north, I think, of any hurricane in modern history back in the fall. And we've seen all sorts of strange weather phenomenon that, while individually might not be attributable to climate change, we have a lot of really amazing scientists who are connecting the dots for us. And sometimes it is hard in the midst of all of those things to keep hope. But I feel for those of us from the faith community, within the faith community, both regular members of congregations and those of us that are in leadership roles within our community of faith, it is our responsibility to bring a voice of hope to this discussion, to recognize that we do have this co-partnership in the story of creation, and that we have been given a huge responsibility to care for creation, to tend and to good. And that there is hope in that partnership, and that there is hope in things that we can do to move us forward and to create that healthy and sustainable future. We also talk about, as people of faith, our need to create justice. And Glenn also talked about the idea of justice between classes. And what we're realizing is a lot of low-income families within our country are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change, particularly pollution coming off coal-fired power plants, because they are situated in these low-income communities and don't have the resources to be able to fight the coal companies, the big industry that are coming in, and they're not necessarily creating sustainable jobs for local community members. Also, again, the issues of equity, justice equity between the nations. As Christians and for other traditions of faith, we have an idea of caring for our neighbor, and it doesn't just mean the person that lives to your left and your right in your little neighborhood here in Richmond, but our global neighbors. What are we doing as a country that impacts our global neighbors, and how can we be better, responsible neighbors for countries that are experiencing these climate refugees because of the rising sea tides and the rising sea levels, and recognizing just what our choices do in that grand scheme of things. And I love what Reverend Pupke said about when you have a moral imperative, you have no choice but to act. And it would be great if everyone understood that, particularly our leaders, our legislators, folks in the international community recognized that there is no option but to act. But unfortunately, as she demonstrated, that's not quite the case. And that's where we as ordinary citizens come in. You have a lot of power as an individual, and you can make choices in your own lives, as well as joining us in advocacy to those decision makers to say, we won't stand for this anymore, and it's time to take action. And I also had a reminder of the definition of insanity is always doing what you've always done and thinking you're going to get something different, but in fact you continue to get the same thing. And we are dealing with a case of insanity here in the United States and globally in many senses when it comes to the need to respond to climate change. And I also wanted to highlight, if I wasn't Presbyterian, I think I would have become Catholic in the last 4 months. I love the new Pope. And just, I believe it was last week, Pope Francis gave a homily on the UN's World Environment Day, and we have a link to it on our social media sites. I would encourage you to go read it. But he talked about this culture of selfishness, and talked about our need to reframe that, and to recognize our neighbors and our need to create a community that supports our neighbors. Particularly for World Environment Day this year, they were talking about food waste and food-related issues, and he talked about how there are plenty of countries that have sufficient food, overproduction of food and food waste, while we have folks in other parts of the world that are going hungry. And just that consumerist society that we live in is not supporting a sustainable and healthy future for the whole globe. But when we work together in partnership, we can work together. And I would just encourage you to continue to think about these issues and ways that you can engage individually and communally around them. And if you're interested, to reach out to us to help you identify ways that you can partner with us on these issues.